Okay, we're still in the middle of chapter 16, 17. We've kind of walked through the beginnings of what we call the Great Depression. We've seen unprecedented unemployment, migrants moving across the country in search for jobs, in search for hope, in search for anything. We see that the number of homeless people congregating outside of cities and, you know, insulting the current president by naming this makeshift shanty towns as Hoovervilles, or covering up with newspapers and calling them Hoover blankets. It really was a brief moment in time where something should have been done or could have been done, but because the government had never been interventionist into the everyday lives of American people, or let's just say as far as intervening during a crisis before. It was always left up to the states. It was always left up to the churches. It was always left up to charitable organizations like the Salvation Army. That didn't happen. And although, Herbert Hoover had an opportunity, because there wasn't precedent for it, and his own mind and way of thinking, he relied on volunteerism. He thought that would just pull Americans out of the Great Depression. As we kind of walk through from 1929 all the way to 1931 here, that really hasn't happened. There really hasn't been much relief. There's been some tweaks to the system that Hoover thought may trickle down and may help society at some point with his Reconstruction Finance Corporation, but even that tended to only benefit a portion of Americans, not those who really needed direct relief. And that's what's key here. We got an overwhelming amount of Americans. They need some direct relief, not down the road, not later, but right now at this current moment. And then, of course, we have a freakish phenomenon happen out in the Great Plains region because of what has been plowed over year after year in layers of topsoil. We get what is known as the Dust Bowl, this massive wind spread across the Great Plains, and literally through static electricity it pulls dust up into it, feeds itself as it moves across the Great Plains, and already ravishing through farms that were on the potential to foreclose because of the hard hit times of the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl was that final little punch that just kind of sent these farmers in bewilderment, looking for something new, something to save them. They packed up their families and they left, and they headed back east, while others were heading west looking for work. I mean, people just began wandering the country. It really was a depressed economy and a depressed mentality that was kind of falling upon the American citizens. Other than that, we know that there's an election coming up in 1932, and we have FDR who promises that there will be happy days here again, and that it's coming, and to have faith in his pragmatic approach. He has this idea of what is called a continual response, this plan that we're going to pass as much legislation as possible in my first 100 days of being president. And if we've got to go back and change some things, if we got to go back and amend some things, pieces of legislation that is, then so be it, we will. But we are going to provide direct relief. We're going to change this non-intervention mentality of all presidents before, and we're going to use the government to directly intervene. Now, to do so, we might have to deficit spend, meaning money that we don't necessarily have taken in as the government yet, but that is the remedy for the current situation. And as Roosevelt took this charge and stepped into office, we saw immediately passage of what became known as the New Deal. And these New Deals focused, number one, on the unemployment, to go ahead and create jobs. Jobs create paychecks. Paychecks create money to spend. Spending gives Americans purchasing power, and purchasing power will revive or prime the pump to get this economy to start to roll again. So that really was kind of the first initiative, and to go ahead and make Americans feel safe to put their money back into banks. So he passed what was called the Federal Emergency Relief Act, and they established a bank holiday, which closed all the banks until inspectors could come in and make sure that those bank deposits were secure before they reopened. Also helped establish what was called the Federal Deposit Insurance Commission, better known as the FDIC. With that being kind of initially the approach, Roosevelt centered on the agricultural sector and the industrial sector, not leaving or showing favor to one or the other, but getting both of them back up on their feet. Whether it was the Agricultural Adjustment Act to suspend the supply until demand came back of farmers and livestock, or to intervene into the industrial setting and kind of be a champion for the workers to make sure that they have jobs and to make sure that they are able to join unions and just really be a government support to the American worker, whether they were the farmer or the industrial worker. Other than that, we kind of see this major, evident expansion of federal power, and that's where you get some criticism. That's where you get criticism from all sides. If you are in a position, much like Abraham Lincoln was, where he had to expand the American presidency during a time of civil war that no other president had been involved in, FDR is going to take that same type of approach. Here we are, no other president's ever been in a crisis like this, a Great Depression like this, and it's going to take big government to remedy the situation. Well, anytime big government is in the process of remedying, fixing a situation, they may look a little totalitarian. And totalitarian was definitely a major issue because as we will see here, there's a rise of totalitarian regimes happening across the world right now. And some try to label or compare FDR's position and what he's doing to that of totalitarian dictators. And even some of his programs as far as creating a welfare state, creating a government program to initiate funds for those who are in need, sounds and potentially looks socialistic in its approach as well. So they're some of his critics, largely from the Republican Party, but not necessarily, some of his own Democrats called the Liberty League, believed that he was destroying the pillars of democracy. That he was tearing down the way things have always been. And of course, anybody who's willing to bring about any significant change to remedy a current situation, some people don't see the potential of the outcome. They focus on the immediate change that's happening, and it's contrary to what they are used to based on traditional ways of doing things, and it seems abrasive. Well, FDR did not care if it seemed abrasive. He was going to fulfill what he promised in those fireside chats. And he was able to connect with the American people, and he had the American people behind him, believing that he was going to be able to pull them out of the Great Depression. A couple things that FDR is going to do as we move into the latter part of the phase 2 of the Second New Deal is a lot of his other criticism is going to come from the fact that the New Deal was focused on one group of Americans, typically young males, and there wasn't too many programs that were created for the rest of Americans or for minority groups or for the elderly. For example, what we will see in the second New Deal package is the passage of the Social Security Act. And this Social Security Act will lay the foundation for the pension system that we have in the United States today, that once a person is over the age of 65, they can draw from this Social Security. In other words, once they're retired and they're in their older stage of life, they're still able to receive some steady income. Now, of course, they've paid into this system in all the years that they've worked. And this really was a long-term, still in use today, program that would secure a group of Americans in their latter parts of their life with some form of income. It really was revolutionary in the form of the government creating a system to take care of the elderly, for example. We also see by 1938, the New Deal has lost a lot of its momentum. It started out basically putting Americans back to work. It started out pumping the economy, getting it going again, but then it flattens out. And it flattens out because what we're going to do is, even though the economy is doing better, and even though Americans are receiving paychecks, they're still not spending. What happens is during a crisis, people are afraid to spend, and they start to save. Well, not a good time to save if you're trying to uplift the economy. So as people are saving and not spending, and the government's the only one spending, eventually that's going to, at some point flatten out, and we actually almost slip into another recession on top of what we've already been in. FDR recognizes that the only way that his New Deal programs can successfully stand the course, or any New Deal programs that he intends to create can continue to pull Americans out of the Great Depression, is if he is able in some way to enlarge the Supreme Court. Because what is happening is the current number of judges on the Supreme Court are striking down a lot of his New Deal legislation, because they are infringing on rights that Americans have and what states have. And during the situation in the moment, sometimes that happens in order to provide relief. So he tries to enlarge or stack, some would say, the Supreme Court with judges, enlarge it to 15 members from 9 to 15, and that way he could get the votes, and that way his New Deal legislation would pass, and that in itself sent the red flag of a totalitarian leader, somebody who's abusing the pillars of democracy, somebody who's trying to enlarge the presidency for his advantage. Whether that was his intentions, or whether his intentions, as he would say, was to further his New Deal legislation, it gets rejected. It doesn't happen. The current number remains at 9, and the Supreme Court never is expanded at this point in history. What it does is it kind of, in some degree, makes FDR look like he has his own agenda, and it kind of distracts from his initial plan of focusing on the American people. But what is going to happen, as we're going to see, there's going to be a push to respond to the events that are conspiring mainly in Europe at this point, but there's also going to be heavy pushback to stay out of what's happening in Europe. And FDR is going to have to make a decision of how we, protect and continue to get the American economy up and running, but at the same time stay free, once again, of foreign entanglements. And that's kind of where we will end this chapter in today's review.